Good afternoon, everyone. Ooh, that's loud. Hi, everybody. Please feel free to grab your lunch. There's more lunches if you need a second lunch. Make yourself comfortable. Welcome to our book talk. My name is Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the executive director here at the Harvard Law School Library. I'm really excited to have you all join us today. I want to thank the dean for co-sponsoring these lunches. I also want to let you know that we are recording today's talk, including any question and answer period, so you're on notice for publicity. Today's book has been hotly anticipated and is a must-read that was released last month, and I'm really thrilled to introduce the author, who the library really got to spend some time working with on this project. Jack Goldsmith is the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Law here at Harvard. He's the author of books and articles on many topics related to terrorism, national security, international law, conflicts of law, and internet law. Before coming to Harvard, he served as the Assistant Attorney General at the Office of Legal Counsel from October 2003 through July 2004, and Special Counsel to the General Counsel to the Department of Defense, which is a heck of a title, from September 2002 through June 2003. He's taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Virginia School of Law. He clerked for Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, Court of Appeals Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson, and Judge George Aldrich on the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal. He's here today to talk to us about his book, In Hoffa's Shadow, A Stepfather, A Disappearance in Detroit, and My Search for Truth. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jack Goldsmith.
So thank you all for coming today. I'm going to speak about my book, about the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance and some other matters. First, I want to say a few thank yous. I first want to, there are many privileges for working as a professor at the Harvard Law School. One is the great library staff. And I could not have written this book without really the extraordinary assistance of probably dozens of people over the years. Who in the library, finding obscure documents, helping me track down documents in other libraries, find impossible things that I didn't think I could find, and they helped me to find. They always did so quickly and in good cheer, and just an extraordinarily, really great group of people. I literally could not have written this book anywhere else in the world probably, and I certainly couldn't have done it without their help, and I'm very grateful. Secondly, I want to thank my assistant, Jan Kashat, who is here today. So Jan had played a special role in this book. She actually did a lot of substantive research for me. But also, maybe most importantly, and I think most enjoyably for her, so I'm going to tell you about my stepfather, Chuckie O'Brien, in a second. He's a character, and I'm going to talk to you in a bit about his efforts to basically not cooperate with my efforts to figure out what he knew about the Hoffa disappearance, and lots of other things. In any event, I literally recorded hundreds of hours with him. And Jan dutifully transcribed those hundreds of hours of tapes. And that sounds like a terrible job, but I bet if you asked Jan, she would say it wasn't the worst thing she's done in a long time. In fact, it may have been interesting because very often when I would pass by and she had the headphones on and was transcribing, she was cracking up. She was laughing, she was in stitches. These were intimate conversations. Jan knows a lot more about me than just about anyone in the world as a result of these conversations. But she also got a flavor of how difficult Chuckie was to work with. And anyway, I'm very, very grateful, Jan, for everything you did. So this is a complicated book, and it's really a book about me and my stepfather and my stepfather's relationship to Jimmy Hoffa. I'm going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, then I'll take any questions you have. I'm going to tell you how I came to write the book, how my life got intersected in the Hoffa disappearance. I'm going to tell you who Jimmy Hoffa is, since half the people in the room probably don't know. And then I'm going to tell you about some lessons I learned. So let's start with Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was the best known and probably most consequential labor leader in the country, certainly the most public-facing labor leader in the country in the 1950s and 60s. He rose to the presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in the late 1950s. The Teamsters is known primarily for organizing truckers, but it actually organizes a whole slew of workers. Hoffa was a brilliant labor organizer. He's not often given credit for this. He was a brilliant bargainer. He centralized the union and basically expanded its power nationally. And he was enormously consequential at a time when labor unions were much more important than they are today, unfortunately. And unfortunately that they're not as important today. He was responsible for raising many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people into the middle class from lower classes. He really improved the conditions for truckers and warehouse workers and many, many other workers, and he was beloved. He was a beloved figure by members of his union. That's the one side of Jimmy Hoffa. The other side of Jimmy Hoffa is that he was corrupt up to his eyeballs by any standard measure. But it was a special kind of corruption. He basically, because of his early days coming up in the union movement in the 1930s, which was an extraordinarily violent time for American unions, Hoffa was on the front lines fighting workers and police who did not want unions to be able to form. This is before the Wagner Act. This is before unions were basically recognized at the federal level. And you literally had to fight to form a union, literally had to fight. And Hoffa literally was in lots and lots of fights in the 30s, trying to win power for his then fledgling union. His first union was actually a bunch of people that he put together at Kroger's on a warehouse dock. And Hoffa, basically from these experiences in which he perceived that the government didn't really comply with the law and that the cops were in bed with the employers and that they were all out to get the unions and that they were violent, he formed the view then, and he kept it his whole life. It was opportunistic, but it was hard won, that the law itself was corrupt, that the government was on the make, and so he never respected the law, and he frequently violated it all of his life. He was referred to as a mobbed-up union organizer. That's a little bit misleading, but it has a large element of truth. Hoffa was never under the control of organized crime. When he expanded his union's power in the 50s and 60s, when he was expanding it nationally from the Midwest and Detroit and from Detroit, when he spread especially to Chicago and New York, but also to other cities, he encountered Teamsters locals that were controlled by the mob. Now, if Hoffa were more conventionally virtuous, he might not have done business with them, but for Hoffa, he didn't really care. For him, the question was always whether he was dealing with the mob or a particular union or a particular type of labor leader or a politician or a judge. For Hoffa, the question was, what can we bargain for? What do I have that you want so that I can get what you have to give me? And so he dealt with the mob as he found it, and he made arrangements, some of them illegal, to accommodate their interests in some of the locals they controlled. And in exchange, he won power that basically helped him become the president of the Teamsters Union, enabled him to do all these great things that I mentioned. It was really part of the bargain. But he had extensive relations with organized crime also, and maybe more importantly, starting in the late 50s, Hoffa started lending out tens and tens of millions of dollars to the mob. Basically, he built Las Vegas and lots of other places, and the mob was desperate for this cash. It couldn't exactly walk into a bank and get it. Hoffa drove a hard bargain. He often said no. He took some on the side for himself, but he did a lot of business with organized crime in terms of the pension fund. So, labor hero, deeply corrupt. He was both things. Okay, that's who Jimmy Hoffa was. He went to jail in 1967. Bobby Kennedy first as the lead investigator of the McClellan Committee in the late 1950s, and then as the Attorney General in the early 60s, pursued Hoffa very aggressively. I have 2 chapters on this in the book because it's really a paradigmatic historical case of overzealous prosecutions. Hoffa was a bad guy. Kennedy cut corners, a lot of corners. And I'd go into detail on that. It's an interesting episode, I think. But in any event, Hoffa goes to jail in 67. He gets out in 71. As a result, Nixon commutes his sentence with a condition that says Hoffa can't get back into the Union until 1980. I don't have time to go into the details about this condition. Let's just say that the machinations, I have a chapter on the Nixon White House and this condition on Nixon's release from prison, and the machinations and corruption that resulted in Hoffa's release matches Watergate in its scope and its breadth and its really stunning nature. Hoffa gets out of jail. He tries to get his union back. He can't get it back because of this condition. And also by this point, his successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, the person he appointed to take over the Teamsters, had, unlike Hoffa, who kept the mob at arm's length from the pension fund and who basically did it on his terms and often said no, Fitzsimmons, who was a weak character, stepped aside and basically organized crime in this country basically had full access to the Teamsters pension fund to do with it what it wanted. And it enjoyed that access. And it didn't want Hoffa to come back. Hoffa was threatening to expose this relationship in the mid-1970s because he desperately wanted his union back and he was going to bring everyone down with him if he couldn't get it back. So he started threatening credibly that he was going to expose the mob's relationship with the Teamsters, and he disappeared on July 30th, 1975 from a parking lot outside of in a Detroit suburb. There's literally not a single piece of direct evidence about what happened to him that day. There's tons of speculation. I'll get into the speculation in a moment. But basically, Hoffa was last seen at 2:45 p.m. in the parking lot. He was expecting a meeting with a mobster. At 3:30, he made a phone call to his wife saying the guy didn't show up. I'm just going to come home. And that was the last anyone ever saw of Jimmy Hoffa. And we literally have no idea to this day what happened to him. I do have some idea. I'll get into that maybe at the end. But we don't have any evidence of what happened. Okay, that's the background to my story. When I was 12 years old. I was living in West Memphis, Arkansas. And my mom married a man named Charles Chuckie O'Brien. This was my third father, my second stepfather, and neither of my previous fathers, my birth father or my first stepfather, were very good fathers. In fact, they were quite bad fathers. And I didn't really have a powerful male figure in my life to that point. Chuckie comes into my life. I'll tell you who he is in a second, but let's just say that he met my mom in January. He and my mom got together in basically January of '75. And 6 months later, they were married. And in those 6 months, I grew very close to him. They got married in June 15th, 1975. I adored him, and I continued to adore him for many years. And I was very, very close to him. He was a wonderful father in many ways, and I'll talk about that too. 6 weeks before Hoffa disappears, my mom marries this guy. 6 weeks later, Hoffa disappears under the circumstances I just said. Who is this guy, Chuckie O'Brien? Chuckie O'Brien turns out to have been Jimmy Hoffa's longtime aide. He met Hoffa when he was 9 years old. He grew up in the Hoffa household. And he was at Hoffa's side basically all the time, every day and night for basically the previous 20 some odd years before Hoffa disappeared, with a little bit of a gap because they had a falling out 6 months before Hoffa disappeared due to my mom. 1 week after the disappearance, this person, who's my new stepfather and who's Hoffa's longtime right-hand aide, becomes the leading suspect in the case. He becomes the person that the FBI is convinced picked up Hoffa and drove him to his death. And this was conventional wisdom. It was stated in the front pages of all the papers that the FBI swore in an affidavit as a basis for collecting evidence. There were all sorts of leaks about how the government knew that Chuckie did this thing, and he was the bad guy. And this was, to put it mildly, a highly traumatic event in our lives. Because the Hoffa disappearance, for those of you old enough to remember, was a zoo. It was a zoo in terms of news coverage. And it was on the front page of the papers and led the evening news for weeks and weeks, and it really didn't go away for many years. And this whole thing enveloped our lives because the government was chasing Chuckie. Chuckie also, I forgot to mention, he was also very closely connected with the mob. Chuckie was half Irish and half Sicilian. And he grew up in a family. His mom was Sicilian, and she had very tight connections with the Kansas City and Detroit families. He basically, Chuckie, even though he was half Irish and therefore couldn't be a made man, for all purposes, he basically held what he describes as Sicilian values, which means primarily that the code of silence, omerta, you don't speak about things you don't know about, as a matter of honor and trust. That was his most important principle. Hoffa disappears, Chucky's the leading suspect, and this thing takes over our lives. My mom goes into a tailspin. She had suffered from mental health problems, and this made it much worse. And basically, for the rest of my teenage years, my name was Jack O'Brien then, because Chuckie adopted me. For the rest of my teenage years, I'm sorry to be talking about myself so much, but it's relevant to the story. There were two important factors in my life. One, the Hoffa investigation was everywhere. There were constant pressure on Chuckie. He went to jail for a year. The government was constantly harassing him. Journalists were constantly harassing him. He had all sorts of problems at work. He had financial problems. So his life, objectively, was a disaster. At the same time, basically my high school years, he was an amazing father. And that seems improbable, but he was. And I talk about this in the book. I won't go into detail, but let's just say he gave me the love and attention and affection and did things with me and gave me security and stability that I never had and I really needed because my mom was really sick. So I was like this with Chuckie. Then I go to college and I go to law school, and over the course of college and law school, I come to rethink Chuckie. Especially in law school, I started to worry about the impact on my legal career. I didn't at the time think that I wasn't sure if I wanted to be in the government, but I thought I might want to work in the government. I didn't know what a security clearance was, but I figured, I wasn't that smart, but I figured, is it going to be a good thing for me to be Jack O'Brien, the son of Chuckie O'Brien, the leading suspect in the Hoffa disappearance, and well-known associate of many major mob figures whom I knew growing up as Uncle Tony Giacalone and Uncle Tony Provenzano. I mean, I was up to my neck in these associations. And they were people I admired, I have to say. As I knew them, they were admirable people. As I read about them later in books, they were vicious killers. But as I knew them, they were admirable people. So to make a long story short, I, like many people in this room, was careerist, self-absorbed, worrying about my future to the exclusion of most things. I'm not damning anyone. I don't know if this rings a bell for anyone. But, and I was, I think I was justified in some sense about worrying about my safety. But a lot of it in retrospect was just me thinking about my life and my career and wanting to separate myself from Chuckie for that reason, and I did. And I brutally cut him out of my life. I stopped talking to him. I changed my name back to Goldsmith, which was my birth name. And I went on with my life. And it's proved to be a wise career decision. I didn't realize what a wise career decision it was, because I got, at every stage of my various government jobs, starting with my first clerkship, I had to get a security clearance. And so for my first security clearance, it was for a Court of Appeals judge I was working for. I fill out the forms you have to fill out, and you have to say, you have to tell what your alias is, what your other names you had, and who all your family and stepfamily was. So I listed my father, and I listed my first stepfather, and I listed my second stepfather, and I said my name was Jack O'Brien from age 13 to 21, and my stepfather was Charles Chuckie O'Brien. I didn't say Charles Chuckie O'Brien, comma, the leading suspect in the disappearance of Hoffa, but I said Charles Chuckie O'Brien. Within a couple of days, I know all this because through the Privacy Act, I collected all these government documents. This sent off various types of alarm bells inside the government, mainly because they thought that they could, through me, learn a lot about the mob and about Chuckie and maybe have an access to learn about the crime, the Hoffa disappearance. So I spent a long day with two FBI agents who were grilling me, and this was frightening. I was 25, didn't know what was going on in the world, didn't know what I got myself into, grilling me about all these mob associations I had and everything I knew about Chuckie and Hoffa and all these mob figures that I was pals with. And I told them the truth, but I also was really vicious towards Chuckie. And I reproduce in the book the FBI summary of the report, and I basically completely tossed him under the bus. To say that it's painful to read now. Basically, I wanted that clearance. I wanted to advance my career. I didn't care about Chuckie. I tossed him under the bus. He hadn't done anything to me, but this was what I did, and I got the clearance. And this continued. Every time I needed to get another security clearance, when I worked in the Defense Department, same issue comes up, but by that point, I'd distanced myself from him so much, and my efforts to not be like him had become so clear that they gave me the clearance. Same thing happened when I was nominated to be the head of OLC in the Justice Department. The people in the White House's jaw hit the floor when I told them, in response to the typical question, is there anything in your background that may embarrass you or the president during your confirmation hearings? And I said, not unless you think being the stepson of the leading suspect in the Hoffa disappearance is disqualifying in any way. And it turned out it wasn't because of what I had done to Chuckie, right? Okay. So, I got the jobs, I get to OLC, and I'm working on a program called Stellar Wind. And you may have heard what Stellar Wind is. This was President Bush's warrantless wiretapping program that was, to put it mildly, had serious legal problems. And I was in the middle of trying to figure out these. This was a very highly classified program, very extensive, and had been blessed for 2.5 years by government lawyers and was integrated entirely into our counterterrorism strategy against al-Qaeda. And so it was very nerve-wracking for everybody involved, including me, for me to be reconsidering whether it was lawful. I had to do so because OLC had to sign off on its legality every 6 weeks. So it fell to me, when I got the job, to approve or not its legality. And that's a long story I won't get into about what I did with that. But in the middle of being knee-deep in this, in many respects, hard to square with the law, very hard to square with the law program, I was reading Fourth Amendment cases, and I came across, many students may remember Berger versus New York, I think it was. It was one of the early revolution cases right before Katz. And I was reading along late one night in the Justice Department, and I come across 2 citations: O'Brien versus United States and Hoffa versus United States. And these were light ghosts to me because I hadn't thought about Chuckie in a long time. I hadn't thought about Hoffa in a long time, and I couldn't believe it. And I read these 2 cases, I printed them out, and they were cases about Chuckie clearly, Hoffa maybe, being illegally surveilled in the early 1960s, and the Supreme Court had vacated their convictions in light of this illegal surveillance. I can go into the details if you have questions later. This was astounding to me for a whole bunch of reasons. It was astounding to me, first of all, because when I was a young man, Chuckie, whom I thought, especially during my especially morally superior phase when I was in college and law school, whom I thought wasn't that smart, he certainly wasn't educated, and not that virtuous. He had told me about all the legal illegalities that Bobby Kennedy and the FBI and the Justice Department committed, and all the illegal surveillance that was done against him. And he had this phrase he called backup. And backup, he always said, the government has backup because they can enforce the law against you, but they don't have to apply it to themselves. They interpret it for themselves in secret, and they don't have to apply it. And basically, until that moment, I hadn't put Chuckie together with what I was doing. I basically didn't believe him. I didn't know about this case. It was kind of an obscure case. And I had not known about these massive illegal electronic surveillance of the mob that the FBI in the 50s and 60s, including under Bobby Kennedy's attorney generalship, had done. And so here I was at this extremely stressful moment in my life trying to figure out this incredibly complicated program. No matter what I did, yes, no, split the baby, was going to be gigantically consequential and cause a lot of people consternation. Had national security implications, it had implications for the criminality of government action. A lot of people were nervous, including me. And in the midst of that nervousness, I was thrust back into this earlier period of my life. And it turned out that my stepfather had been, and this didn't all come to me in a flash, although I was startled, he had been right in what he had said about government illegal electronic surveillance. He had been right about backup. He had been right about a somewhat famous Supreme Court case. It was, in the 60s, it was more famous than it is today. And yet here I was, the morally superior person who had denounced him to only so that I could be able to get this job. And there I was in the Justice Department, and I was doing the very things, my hands were as dirty as they could be, doing the very things that he had criticized the Kennedy Justice Department about, namely dealing with cutting corners and maybe cutting corners of my own in the course of helping the government pursue the enemy within. The enemy within in the 2000s was al-Qaeda. The enemy within in the early 1960s was organized crime and communists to some extent. Yes, communists also. And there were other enemies within. So that was the beginning of my reconsideration of Chuckie. over the course of the next 9 months, I left the Justice Department 6 months later. And then over the course of that year, I had a complete rethink about everything that had happened in the last 25 years for a whole bunch of reasons, having to do with my faith, having to do with the fact that I had children then, young children, and until I had my own children, even though my mom had made clear to me how terribly devastating it was when I blew Chuckie off 20, 25 years ago, this man who had only showed me love, I didn't really appreciate how I had hurt him. In fact, I didn't think about it very much. And over the course of the next year, it became crystal clear to me. As I say, mostly because of my own children, and I realized how much I loved them, how vulnerable I was, and how much it would have devastated me if they did to me what I did to Chuckie. So, to make a long story short, Chuckie and I were, as I say, I didn't visit him for 20 years, but I finally changed my mind after I had children because my mom said, "You can come visit, but this time Chuckie's not leaving. He's not well." I used to not visit if he were there. That's how bad it was. So we visited, and this time I was kind to him, and he reciprocated, and we had 3 great days together. He was not well, and it was just kind of like the good old days, the Jack O'Brien days. And one night, we were watching Seinfeld, and I asked him, I just turned to him and I said, "I hope you'll forgive me. I'm very sorry for what I did for the last 20 years. It was wrong, and I hope you forgive me." And I'm not going to be able to tell you what he did without crying, so I'll just say he forgave me. You can read it in the book, if you read the book. So this is all prelude to why I wrote this book. Over the next several years, Chuckie and I had many conversations. We became very, very close, much closer. And of course, since I'm an adult now and not a teenager, in a much different type of relationship, but much closer than ever before. And we talked and talked and talked because he couldn't do much. He's not well, he can't get around very much, but we talked for hours and hours and hours, and we talked about the Hoffa disappearance for hours and hours and hours. And if there's one piece of conventional wisdom in the Hoffa disappearance for 44 years, a piece of conventional wisdom that's going to be repeated in the Scorsese film, which premieres this weekend, that's been repeated in every book for the last 44 years and just about every story, it's that Chuckie O'Brien, my stepfather, picked up Jimmy Hoffa and drove him to his death. It is hard for me to exaggerate how much this ruined Chuckie's life and destroyed his honor, since Hoffa was basically his father. He always insisted it wasn't true, and I came to believe him without having done any research, just in the course of our conversations, for a whole bunch of reasons. I should add, Chuckie's a famous, notorious liar. That's a piece of background that's relevant. The first thing you read in the first Hoffa memo when they're describing Chuckie O'Brien, all of his friends say he's a pathological liar. And there's an element of truth in that. Even growing up, he would stretch the truth. And I thought it was funny and thought it was humorous, and it never really had any material effect on anything. He was an exaggerator. So that's a piece of background, because basically after these conversations, I said to him one day, and in part to make up for the pain that I caused him for 20 years, if I even could do that, I said, "Why don't we write a book about this?" Because based on what you've told me and based on what I've read, and I had done practically no research at that point, I concluded that I actually didn't, as I say, I didn't think he did it, and I knew at that point that I could give him a fair shake. The circumstantial case against him was full of holes, it was obvious, and I knew I could give him a fair shake by writing a book, and that's what I set out to do. And I told him, "There's only one condition, you have to tell me the truth." And that was hard for him because of omerta. He's not supposed to tell the truth about the things he knew or might have known about anything having to do with his organized crime connections. Okay, so the main goal I had in writing the book was to try to see if I could vindicate Chuckie from this claim. And believe it or not, I think I did. And I think just about every reader who has read the book comes away from it thinking that Chuckie almost certainly, I can't prove a negative, but he almost certainly didn't do it. There was a whole bunch of holes in the circumstantial case against him. The timeline of his known whereabouts, when you look at certain information that was never discussed in the public record, makes it almost impossible for him to have had time to go to pick up Hoffa that day. Chuckie, alone among the suspects, spent a lot of time talking to the FBI. He would not be around today if there was anything he could have revealed in those meetings about what happened that afternoon. There's a whole bunch of other circumstantial evidence in the book about why I don't think Chuckie did it, but the most convincing fact is that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, since the 1990s, it turns out, doesn't believe Chuckie did it. They think this because of a whole bunch of, because they too figured out there were new people on the case who looked at the record after the fact in a more objective way. They too came to find the holes in the circumstantial case against him. They developed independent evidence about who did it and became convinced that the original theory of the case was just dead wrong and led the Bureau in just a terribly wrong direction, primarily because they focused on Chuckie. Understandably, since there was more evidence about him than others. I'm happy to talk about that during the discussion if you want. And the FBI, it turns out, since the 1990s, kind of unbeknownst to me, I didn't understand the extent of it, had been approaching Chuckie saying, we think you're innocent. We want you to come take a lie detector test. Tell us the truth, and we will basically clear your name. We made a mistake in the 1970s. Pretty extraordinary. So I went, but Chuckie didn't go through with it because he didn't trust them, and he had very good reason not to trust the FBI, in his world especially. So, but when I started writing this book and he shows me these letters from the FBI agents, the first thing I do is go to Detroit to talk to these people. And again, to make a long story short, the government, the U.S. Attorney in Detroit and the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Detroit made Chuckie an offer. They said, if you come to us and interview with us and you tell us the truth, we will exonerate you. We will send you a letter saying that you are not a target or a subject of the investigation of the Hoffa disappearance. That would have been revolutionary news in the little world of Hoffa lore because everybody thinks Chuckie did it. And it was an enormous deal to Chuckie. For 44 years, he'd been trying to clear his name of this crime. They never indicted him for the crime. They almost did. But he's been stuck with it and tagged with it, in history, basically. Chuckie, at an advanced age and not in good health, and it was an illegally fraught situation that many people advised us not to do. He shows up for 4 hours. He tells them everything they wanted in one of the 4 of the best hours of my life because he was hilarious and truthful, and the FBI guys were there wide-eyed because, oh my God, Chuckie O'Brien's talking to us about the Hoffa disappearance. It was an amazing thing. He told the truth about what he knew. He walked out of there. A week later, the assistant U.S. attorney calls and said, we think it went well. I believe him. We're going to get together and decide. 2 weeks later, we were told that the U.S. attorney had decided he was truthful and the letter would be forthcoming maybe the next day. The letter never came. And I didn't recount why in the book. It's too complicated to get into now, but suffice it to say, I'm happy to tell you in question and answer. I need to wrap up. Suffice it to say that the political people at the top didn't want to take the heat of the responsibility of admitting an FBI mistake over the last 30 or 40 years. That was the reason that they decided. They basically decided what's in it for me to put my name on this letter admitting a huge and embarrassing FBI mistake over 30 years. So even though all the career agents and the career attorneys had been working the case were completely convinced and had this other slew of evidence pointing to someone else, they didn't come through. And it was when I was angrier about that than I've ever been about anything in my life. And Chuckie was disappointed too, obviously. So look, there's a lot in the book. The book is about law enforcement mistakes and some systematic problems with law enforcement that we learned about in law school, but that really come home to you when your close relative has been accused of one of the most notorious crimes in American history wrongly. It turns out there's an easy mechanism for accusing someone publicly of doing something wrong and no real mechanism for pulling that back. That's really hard. I'm still working on it, but I'm not confident. There's a whole lot in the book about the history of surveillance. It turns out that the origins of the surveillance state got connected up with, included surveillance of the mob in the 50s and 60s. Not the origins, but the early middle part of the surveillance state. And I came across thousands of hours of legal transcripts involving Chuckie and Hoffa, and some really amazing stuff that really helps one understand the evils of illegal surveillance. And that's amazingly, that stuff tied up to the work I did in 2004. There are lots of historical ironies that I uncovered that I won't get into now. I guess I'm going to stop because I'm over time. I guess the last lesson I'll leave you with that I learned about, and I don't mean to be preachy, but I'm going to be. When I was, for the students in the room, when I was your age and in your position, I wasn't at this law school, but I was at another fine law school. It's so clear to me now. You know, what seemed like the right decisions to make for career and self were incredibly narrow-minded and self-serving. And hopefully you won't, you know, I think students today are, if anything, more, and I'll use this term advisedly, mindlessly careerist and jumping through the right hoops for the right law reviews and clerkships because you want to get that special job that's going to make your life so happy. And I'm just here to tell you, hopefully you won't have the horrible decisions, you won't make decisions like the ones I made when I was in your shoes that caused enormous pain to someone and that allowed me to get to the, you know, the height, the Office of Legal Counsel. And then I got there and it was awful and it definitely wasn't worth it. And it definitely wasn't worth what I did to Chuckie to do it. And ever since then, I have done some things that I wish I'd done before, and that is to really figure out why I'm doing the things I'm doing, what's really important to me, what do I really value, and how am I going to maintain those values, and how do my career aims and my grasping on the career ladder, how does it affect and impact what I really value, if you even know or have reflected on what you really value, which I really urge you to do. Because I can promise you, and this is my last preachy thing, you can get all those hoops and all those clerkships and things like that, but they will not give you happiness. And they won't keep you from hurting people. And you will regret it if you don't keep these other values in mind. And on that note, I'll be happy to take your questions.
Well, this is a remarkable novel. Your life is a novel, and it's the novel of a beloved teacher and colleague. There's an episode which you do not cover. It's public, so I'm risking no indiscretion.
That doesn't follow, but go ahead.
When our great former dean, Elena Kagan, took the bold step of muscling the faculty into appointing you, there was a certain amount of opposition. Indeed, the opposition wrote a long piece in the Boston Globe designating you as a war criminal because you were involved with torture and enhanced investigation and so on. And if we voted you that appointment, we would be like the German faculty members in the early days of Nazism. That was how it was told. Wonderful Dean Kagan just bulled through it. And she knew, and you knew, and fortunately, shortly thereafter, the whole world knew because there was a leak in Newsweek, which said that, in fact, yes, you had been in the Defense Department, the Department of Justice, and you had withdrawn the torture memos, a remarkable thing to do. You had been a hero, but you did not defend yourself. You were rather like Chuckie, who did not, he knew who drove that car. And having read your book, I have my own suspicions. But omerta, he did not say. And you did not blow the whistle on these people, but your omerta is called lawyer-client relationship, and you didn't do it. Fortunately, the cover was blown, and then you were able to write your book, which you did, not this book, another book. And there are remarkable parallels. You as Chuckie, and also I think of Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who John Yoo, I mean, the circles are amazing, because John Yoo is the man whose memo you withdrew. John Yoo said, this man was a spy, he's a traitor, his loyalties were to the land of his birth. He left Ukraine at the age of 3, the way I left Prague at the age of 4, and that's where his loyalties were. And of course, our great president indicates anybody who did that is a traitor to me, because me is the country, and probably would have been shot. And that's your story. You're lucky not to have gotten shot. But
I still might get shot. I'm, a little worried about that after this.
We're lucky that you didn't.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Charles. I actually have 2 things to say about that, if you don't mind. One is, I'm glad you mentioned it, because my situation, when I got out of the government and I was being accused of something, and in pretty extreme terms, that I knew wasn't true. But I had no tools. There were no tools I had to rebut it until, as you say, a whole bunch of other stuff came out. And I just had no tools to rebut it. And I thought about Chuckie, because he didn't have any tools. He had many more pressures and cross-cutting pressures, mob pressure and government pressure and family pressure. And he didn't have the tools to rebut it. And it's a devastating situation to be in when you're accused of something horrible and you just can't do anything to redress it. But I identified with Chuckie very much in that situation as well. That's one of the other things that led me to seek his forgiveness. The other thing, I'll tell a story. I hope Elena doesn't mind me telling this. So Charles refers to the fact that I wasn't here, but I gather that my appointment was someone controversial on the faculty. I mean, a Bush administration official involved in torture stuff, but also, more importantly, someone skeptical of international law. That's really hard here. And so I'll never forget this. So Elena, of course, used to work in the White House counsel's office, and she knew the number. And the morning that the story broke, the first story leaked about the so-called torture memos on the front page of the New York Times, happened to be the day, I don't know if you remember this, Charles, that the faculty was due to vote on my appointment. Now, I have to tell you that, in Washington, you can't believe the pressure and the things that were going on, the torture memo stuff and the warrantless surveillance stuff and the world exploding and another attack is coming. The vote of the Harvard Law Review School faculty that afternoon was not in the top 1,000 things I worried or cared about. It really was not something I was obsessed with. But Elena was worried about it, and so I'm sitting in Alberto Gonzalez's office talking about this front page story and what are we going to do about it. And I'm basically telling him we're going to withdraw that other opinion. And I got a message that comes in, call Elena Kagan. And so, again, I'm not focused on Harvard. I walk outside, I'm waiting for the car to pick me up to take me back to the Justice Department. I call Elena, and she says, Jack, I have to tell you that if you had asked me before I read the New York Times this morning, I would have said the chances of you being voted an offer by the Harvard Law School faculty are 99%, because Elena was a good vote counter. But this story gives me very serious pause, and my faculty is going to ask me about it this afternoon. So I have to ask you, were you responsible for authorizing torture? Now, the answer was absolutely not. However, I couldn't talk about it. this was still a very highly classified program, and I'm not supposed to be talking about it to anyone, especially on the phone, obviously. So I said, Elena, especially not to Elena Kagan, I said, Elena, I can't address this program. I can't talk about it. All I can tell you is I would never authorize a commission of torture, full stop. That was the end of the conversation, and I don't know what happened in the faculty meeting, but I got the job, and here I am. Any other questions? Over here.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I had the pleasure of having lunch with Phil Berrigan, the famous Jesuit anti-war activist Dan and Phil Berrigan, and he described being in the federal penitentiary in Danbury and having his next-door neighbor be Jimmy Hoffa. It was a pretty interesting story. I would like to hear you explain because I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, what do you believe is the most credible, plausible account of what did happen, how it happened, and what evidence there may be, if any, for that?
Good.
And why?
I'm glad you asked that. So it is clear, this much I believe is clear from the evidence and from what I learned from Chuckie and from many other sources, and it's kind of conventional wisdom, but I have more evidence for it. The Hoffa hit was a national decision made by the commission in New York, the 5 families. The Detroit family would not have had the authority to knock off Hoffa because the implications would have been national. It was approved at the highest of levels. There's always been speculation about who carried out the deed. And the early theories was that it was people from the East, people from Anthony Provenzano's crew who came into Detroit, did it, and then left. There's never, the evidence for that went up in smoke, but there was informant evidence, which unbeknownst to the public turned out not to be credible. That whole original theory that included Chuckie turned out to be quicksand, but the public never learned about that. The government developed a different theory starting in the 90s based on, and I can only tell you what I know, I don't know everything. A different theory based on informant evidence and on electronic surveillance evidence. They came to believe that Hoffa was picked up by a man named Vito Giacalone, who was the brother of Anthony Giacalone. Anthony Giacalone was my Uncle Tony, who was close to Chuckie and who was close to Hoffa. And Vito would be someone that Hoffa might get in the car with. He knew him very well. And that they think that the person who did it, and I'm not going to name his name, and I'll explain why, was a man he's now deceased. He was a low-level crime figure in Detroit at the time, and he rose in prominence soon after the disappearance and kept rising and became a big man in Detroit, the Detroit crime family. And he was caught on tape bragging about it, talking about taking responsibility for it in a way that corroborated some other things the FBI knows, and they believe that. And in fact, that was the basis for the latest FBI dig in 2013. The reason I'm not going to name his name, my publisher wanted me to name his name, but I figured, I don't know what the evidence. Vito has long been a suspect of some sort or another, and he was clearly involved in some way, so I don't mind repeating that. But this other guy, it's never been mentioned. The FBI seems confident it was him, but basically I feel like that if I had written a book basically criticizing the government for putting out a theory about Chuckie without an evidentiary basis and naming him and ruining his life, I didn't think it would be right for me to do the same thing to this guy, even though he's deceased. People will figure it out, and some people know, but that's what I know. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for writing the book.
There's a microphone.
Thanks very much for writing the book. I learned quite a bit. I just want to, before I get to my question, remark that I myself am a proud Teamster. I was 25 years as a truck driver, and I'm proud to say I have a pension today as a result of collective bargaining. I had great health care when I was a worker as a truck driver. So I owe a lot to the union movement. as do a lot of my coworkers. We've had some great leaders, and we've had some leaders who failed us. And we've all been concerned about internal union democracy, because union control of the union really, and voting on your contract, is extremely important to your progress as a worker. Just one more thing I would say is that I would be remiss not getting up and also expressing my solidarity with the graduate student union at Harvard, who are currently in a struggle, and I admire their courage as they proceed. I want to ask about the surveillance state, because it's been with us, as you say, for a long while. It's been here, and it's acted against civil rights workers, as you mentioned in your book, like Martin Luther King, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, signing off on the surveillance of Martin Luther King. And it's been applied to many other movements struggling for their rights. So I want to, I know how Hoffa and your father, you say this in your book, how they tried to address this question, tried to educate the membership on the danger of the surveillance state. In fact, your father was distributing copies of 1984 to workers in different union locals. Now, a lot of our members who were working 60-plus hours a week, they were not big book readers, but there was an attempt to educate them on the danger of the surveillance state. So I ask you, given your experience inside the state and being part of that, what would you say to us? How do we organize against the surveillance state? How do we fight back? What do we have to be worried about in the future, especially with the rise of the technology that allows our every movement to be monitored? Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a good question. I talk about it at length in the book, and I wrote an essay in The Atlantic that's an adaptation of the book that really focuses on that question and the future of surveillance. So I'm going to give a very brief answer. It won't be satisfactory. You should be very worried about the surveillance state. And you should be very worried about the surveillance state because the government, since the beginnings of electronic surveillance, has had an insatiable appetite for it. And they have an insatiable appetite for it because they gather all sorts of extraordinary information relevant to their duties to keep the country safe and to prevent and redress crime. And Congress and the courts have occasionally put up obstacles to this, and the history of surveillance, speaking pretty generally but accurately, is a history of Congress and the courts putting up hurdles, the government in secret, especially with some new technologies, acting to circumvent those hurdles because it feels very strongly that it has to keep the country safe, and it comes up with opportunistic interpretations of the law, and so it gets way out ahead of what the people think it's doing. This is what happened in the 50s and 60s. It's what happened in the early 2000s. And the situation is, in many ways, so that's one point. I do believe that the system we have today, as compared to 15 years ago when I was working in the government, and certainly to the 50s and 60s, for controlling and ensuring that the surveillance state is lawful, it is much more robust, much more successful. There are many, many more checks inside the government, many more hoops that have to be gone through, many more veto points. I have much more confidence today than I had in 2004, and certainly that I would have in the 50s and 60s, that the government is surveilling in a lawful manner, which is not to say I'm sure they're always surveilling in a lawful manner. The real danger, of course, is that technology is racing way out ahead of the law. The law can't keep up with technological change, and a lot of the surveillance these days is being done by private firms to whom we give private information that the government in various ways can get access to, or that the companies can use. So the essential problem today is that technology with sensors on everything, and with artificial intelligence, and with endless data collection, that everything is being surveilled, and the law is simply way behind in catching up to regulating it. But here's the real kicker. Surveillance is necessary for our security. I believe that. I believe it's seriously subject to abuse, but I believe it's also necessary to keeping us safe. I believe that firmly. And the trick is to get the right trade-off, and it is definitely a trade-off between our exposure and nakedness to the government and the government's need for certain information that's proportionate to figuring out what the problem is and preventing crime. And there is no magic bullet about where that line can be drawn. And it's something that we debate in our democracy. Things have gotten much more transparent as a result of both what happened in 2004 and especially the Snowden revelations. And in fact, we've had really extraordinary debates about the surveillance state in the last 5 or 6 years. But here's the depressing piece of news for someone who holds the views that I think you hold. When push comes to shove and we have these debates, the American people through Congress signs off on it. That's the reality. You can get as mad as you want about the executive branch and the courts, but the reality is when push comes to shove and the case is made to Congress, and this happened when Barack Obama was president, Congress approves these techniques. It tends to put on more procedures and more internal watchdogs, but it's a very tricky problem because our adversaries have technologies too, and things are going to get a lot worse in terms of our nakedness, and we will continue to put procedures upon procedures and laws upon laws. But if you worry about being surveilled, it's going to get a lot worse. And that's the shorthand answer I can give. Any other questions? Going once, twice. Question here?
Not really a question. I would request you, if you haven't done so already, to write a piece on what we were speaking about. That think before you betray people who have helped you, and don't put your career first. It was a lovely piece.
Well, thank you. But I did do that in the book, and I thank you. I mean, I have to say, when I wrote this book, I didn't know how it was going to be received. One of the most gratifying and unexpected things about this book is the dozens of people already, and I'm not exaggerating, who have written me saying, this is not an easy book to write. It's extremely personal. And I don't come off as a hero, I promise. I come off as not such a great guy in many parts of my life. And part of the book is about how the world looks differently in different stages of your life. But I've been extremely gratified by the literally dozens of people who've written me in with some version of, thank you so much for talking about your forgiveness of your stepfather and why you thought that you should take that step, because it's something that I haven't been thinking about but should be thinking about with my family. And the last thing in the world I thought of was that part of the book would influence anyone to do something, and apparently it has. Again, it's not what I set out to do. So maybe the book accomplishes what you think I should do. And one more question? Yeah.
Well, thank you for the wonderful novel story, and I would like to know more about, you just mentioned the struggle, because you once served as a government official, especially yourself as an attorney general, and you know that Chuckie O'Brien suffered the media, and your book is trying to reveal the real suspect of the crime. So is there any struggle between, using a book as another tool besides you yourself work as a government official? You have the power to clarify a case. Is there any struggle, at least as a tool?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you just rephrase it briefly? I mean, what is the struggle you want me to discuss?
I mean, you work as a general attorney.
I was assistant attorney general.
Yes, you work in the real case. Yeah, you have the power, the tools, to trying to find the evidence, clarify all cases. But now it's a case that you have to reveal to media, to the public. Use the book as a tool.
Yes.
To clarify Chuckie O'Brien's name.
Right, that's what I tried to
But
do.
that's another threat to the real suspect.
It's another what?
a threat.
Who's it a threat to?
I mean, yeah.
The other suspect, you mean the other suspect, once Chucky's cleared, the finger may be
Yes.
pointed at the other suspect?
Yeah, you mentioned the struggle about not to mention his name
Yeah,
because,
so
yeah.
fortunately, the other suspect is dead. He passed away. I'm not even sure I would have revealed as much information as I did in the book if he hadn't passed away. Look, that was a hard line call. A lot of people wanted, I know a lot about the Hoffa disappearance that I didn't put in the book. And maybe I'll write an essay about it one day. But I thought about this a lot, that first of all, I didn't want the book about, okay, I'm going to tell you who really killed Jimmy Hoffa. That is not what this book was about, and I didn't want it to seem like that. So I only talked about what I knew in a pretty understated paragraph at the end of the book. I can tell you, as I say, my publisher did not want that to be the way it was done, but that's the way I thought it should be done. This person is not threatened, if I understand your question correctly, because this person is dead. There are still people around, the relatives of these people whom I talked about, who are still in the mob, and they might or might not be happy about this book, but I took a calculated risk. Thank you very much.